There's something happening inside your brain right now that you're completely unaware of. It's quiet, invisible, and most people will never realize it's even there. But for millions living in poverty, this hidden mechanism is working against them every single day, making decisions harder, opportunity scarcer, and escape routes nearly impossible to see. And here's what really shakes me. It has nothing to do with intelligence, character, or work ethic. In fact, if you woke up tomorrow in their shoes, you'd likely fall into the exact same patterns. So what is this invisible force, and why does it keep people trapped in cycles they desperately want to break? Before we get into the answer, I need you to understand something that most people get completely wrong. We've been taught that poverty is simple. People make bad choices because they lack education, discipline, or motivation. But researchers at Princeton and Harvard discovered something that flips this narrative on its head. What if poverty isn't the result of bad decisions? What if poverty itself makes it nearly impossible to make good ones? In 2013, economists Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir published research showing that the experience of not having enough fundamentally changes how the brain operates, consuming mental resources and leaving less available for other critical tasks. They didn't study this in abstract terms. They went to a shopping mall in New Jersey and tested real people with actual money concerns. And what they found was disturbing. When people with limited financial resources were asked to think about a difficult financial scenario, like a $1,500 car repair, their performance on basic cognitive tests dropped dramatically. The impact? A 13-point decline in IQ, equivalent to losing an entire night's sleep. But here's where it gets interesting. Wealthy people facing the same scenario showed no decline at all. Same problem, different response. The difference wasn't intelligence or capability. It was bandwidth. Let me explain what bandwidth actually means, because this is where the psychology gets fascinating. Your brain has a finite amount of mental energy available at any given time. Think of it like the RAM in your computer. When bandwidth is taxed by immediate concerns, there's simply less available for other judgments and decisions, leading to choices that might seem irrational to an outside observer. When you're worried about keeping the lights on, paying for groceries, or avoiding eviction, those concerns don't just stress you out. They actively consume the cognitive resources you need for everything else. The researchers wanted to test this in the real world, so they found the perfect natural experiment: sugarcane farmers in India. These farmers received their entire annual income at harvest time, creating predictable cycles where they're poor before harvest and relatively wealthy afterward. The same people, tested at two different points in their financial year, and the results were stark. Each farmer performed significantly better on intelligence and cognition tests after harvest compared to before, when financial concerns were consuming their mental resources. Now here's what makes this so insidious. It's not that being poor makes you stupid. Your actual cognitive ability hasn't changed. But when your brain is constantly running calculations about trade-offs, juggling bills, and worrying about immediate survival, it has less processing power left over for planning, learning new skills, or making strategic decisions that could improve your situation long-term. This creates a scarcity mindset characterized by increased focus on immediate goals at the expense of peripheral tasks and long-term planning, potentially perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Imagine you're choosing between two job opportunities. One pays slightly more right now, but has no benefits or advancement potential. The other pays less initially, but offers training, healthcare, and a clear path to promotion. Which do you choose? If your rent is due in 3 days and you're not sure how you'll cover it, your brain isn't weighing long-term career trajectories. It's solving the immediate problem of keeping a roof over your head. When you can afford so little, So many things need to be resisted, and resisting multiple temptations depletes willpower, making people less capable of giving up immediate rewards for future benefits. This is where the psychology gets really dark. Research using neuroimaging has shown that a scarcity mindset actually alters how the brain processes decisions, affecting neural mechanisms underlying goal-directed decision-making. Your brain physically operates differently under conditions of scarcity. The parts responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, your prefrontal cortex, get overwhelmed by the constant cognitive load of managing limited resources. And there's another layer to this that most people don't consider. Perceptions of those in poverty are extremely negative in society, stereotyped as lacking warmth and competence, associated with feelings of contempt and harms behaviours toward this group. But here's what's particularly cruel. These stereotypes don't just affect how others see poor people, they affect how poor people see themselves. Studies show self-stereotyping effects, where stereotypic perceptions influence group members' self-evaluation and psychological performance, reducing self-efficacy and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Think about what this means. You're already fighting against a brain that's functioning with reduced capacity because of financial stress. Now add the weight of internalized shame, reduced confidence in your own abilities, and constant exposure to messages that your situation is somehow your fault. The psychological burden becomes overwhelming. But wait, doesn't this mean that if we just gave poor people money, the problem would solve itself? Surprisingly, no. And this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of poverty psychology. Research analysing lottery winners, high-paid athletes, and people who receive sudden windfalls shows that many end up broke despite having immense wealth, because a scarcity mindset doesn't instantly change when you become flush with cash. Decades of operating under cognitive constraints create patterns that don't disappear overnight. Here's why. People living in circumstances of poverty often make decisions that may cause their situation to deteriorate in an attempt to alleviate their financial situation, such as taking out loans at higher interest rates, saving less, and participating more often in lotteries. These aren't irrational choices when you understand the context. When you're in survival mode, a payday loan with a 400% interest rate isn't a long-term financial strategy. It's a way to keep your car running so you can get to work tomorrow. The decision makes sense within the tunnel of scarcity, even though it worsens the long-term situation. Researchers call this tunneling, the intense focus on immediate scarcity that comes at the expense of everything else. When you really want something, you start to focus on it obsessively, producing a kind of tunnel vision that explains why, when we're in a hole, we often lose sight of long-term priorities and dig ourselves deeper. It's the same mechanism that makes a hungry person unable to think about anything except food, or a lonely person fixated on finding companionship. And there's something even more troubling that researchers discovered. Poverty may reduce not just what people can consume, but also how much enjoyment they get from whatever they do manage to consume. A cognitive double tax on well-being where bandwidth constraints diminish the experiential value of consumption. Imagine being so preoccupied with financial stress that you can't even fully enjoy the small pleasures you manage to afford. The cognitive burden of poverty doesn't just make planning harder, it makes life itself less enjoyable. Now I know what some of you are thinking, but I know people who grew up poor and made it out. What about them? And you're right, people do escape poverty. But here's what the research shows. It's not that they somehow avoided the psychological effects. Those who successfully transition out of poverty often do so by developing external systems, calendars, reminders, financial counselling, and structured support that helps them manage cognitive load and look beyond immediate needs. They create scaffolding around their decision-making because they understand, consciously or not, that their cognitive bandwidth is under assault. This brings us to the controversial part that makes some people uncomfortable. If poverty changes how the mind works, regardless of who experiences it, then qualities often considered part of someone's basic character, impulsive behaviour, poor performance, poor financial decisions, may actually be products of a pervasive feeling of scarcity rather than personal failings. Put bluntly, if you were made poor tomorrow, you'd probably start behaving in many of the same ways currently associated with poor people. The implications of this research are staggering. It means that many of our assumptions about poverty, that it's primarily about lack of education, lack of motivation, or poor character, are fundamentally wrong. The researchers argue that the lack of financial resources itself can lead to impaired cognitive function, meaning the very condition of not having enough can actually be a cause of poverty rather than just a symptom. It's a feedback loop. Poverty reduces cognitive function, which makes it harder to escape poverty, which further reduces cognitive function. So what do we do with this information? First, we stop judging. When you see someone making a choice that seems obviously wrong from your perspective, taking that payday loan, buying lottery tickets, missing appointments, understand that their brain is operating under constraints yours probably isn't. Those experiencing scarcity frequently encounter obstacles when performing basic tasks that well-resourced individuals can easily prevent or eliminate, creating unsolvable problems that trigger avoidance-based coping responses and chronic stress. Second, we recognize that solutions need to address cognitive load, not just bank accounts. Programs could be redesigned to lower the cognitive burden of decisions, offering single appointment times instead of multiple options, limiting choices when selecting health plans, breaking large decisions into smaller ones, and timing decisions for when mental resources are less depleted. These aren't handouts, they're acknowledgements of psychological reality. Third, we need to fundamentally rethink how we design systems that poor people interact with, every complicated form, every maze of bureaucracy, every requirement to jump through multiple hoops. These aren't just annoying. For someone operating with reduced bandwidth, they're nearly insurmountable barriers that consume the exact cognitive resources needed to escape poverty. The research on poverty psychology reveals something profound about human nature. We're all far more similar than we think. The difference between making good decisions and bad ones often isn't wisdom or willpower. It's simply having enough mental space to think clearly. Research suggests that the cognitive burden of poverty imposes a mental load equivalent to losing 13 IQ points, affecting approximately 1 in 8 Americans currently living below the poverty line. Understanding this doesn't excuse every poor decision or absolve everyone of responsibility, but it does force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The psychology of scarcity creates a trap that's incredibly difficult to escape through willpower alone. It's not about being weaker or less capable, it's about operating a high-performance vehicle with half the fuel and twice the obstacles, then being blamed when you don't win the race. The invisible mechanism I mentioned at the start, it's your brain trying to survive under impossible conditions, making the best choices it can with limited bandwidth, while society judges those choices as character flaws. The real question isn't why poor people stay poor. The question is, given everything we now know about how poverty hijacks cognition, how does anyone manage to escape at all? And more importantly, what would happen if we designed our systems with this psychological reality in mind, instead of pretending it doesn't exist?